Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Marvin Liao, and okay, great, awesome. So thank you so much for coming and showing up this morning. So just to give quick context about who I am and sort of hopefully why I'm qualified to speak about this. So I'm actually a partner of 500 Startups. 500 Startups is a early stage venture capital firm based out of Silicon Valley. We started about 5 years ago, and so we've probably made close to 1,500 investments worldwide. Obviously, a large portion of them are mobile with the world that we're living in right now. I'm actually a partner. I run the San Francisco office, so I'm a partner for the main fund. We have close to $225 million under management. And I also run the San Francisco Accelerator program. And so this hopefully gives you a general view of sort of why and hopefully how I'm going to be able to sort of speak about some of this stuff. All right, let's go through this. All right, so a couple things. No surprise, mobile startups are freaking hard, right? And so one of the challenges of sort of operating in the global sort of like mobile world, and hopefully most of this should be very obvious, right? Mobile marketing, really challenging of trying to figure out like app store optimization versus in the desktop world of like SEO, completely different things. And so at least in SEO, it's a little bit more controllable. And also the other part is just from an engagement perspective, it's just really hard to sort of keep your users. And so I'm not trying to sort of paint all the bad picture. I want to give you sort of a little bit of a landscape. And the other part from monetization perspective, traditionally most mobile monetization has actually been through like advertising. Advertising, and I've spent over 12 years in this business, sucks actually from a monetization, particularly mobile, right? Versus say in the desktop world too. And the other one is just trying to understand sort of like outside of iOS, which actually has like a very good payment platform, it's just really, this is another reason why monetization is challenging. Google Play from monetization perspective is not as good as iOS right now. Who knows if that's going to change or not? I assume it will be. And the other part too is from iOS and Android perspective of which platform do you build for, right? Because it's the more complexity when you're starting off as a startup. Building an iOS as well as an Android app. These are two very different things, two very different platforms. And so, for example, in the US or in certain parts of Western Europe, iOS makes way more sense because of just easier monetization and better reach. In most other parts of the world, it's actually Android. In most of Asia, which I know fairly well, Android is the dominant platform. Android is the dominant platform outside the US and Western Europe. And the other part too is just all the big guys, especially a startup, there's not a lot of open spaces. Alibaba, Tencent, Facebook, Google, they're all playing in key areas that you as a startup would actually be looking to build in. All right, let's see this. All right. So, saying all that stuff, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the trends. And so just to clarify, right, these are trends that are unsexy and that investors hate. Doesn't mean that you can't make a good business, but if you are trying to raise money from investors, these are challenging areas. So just want to clarify, so I don't mean to insult anybody in the room if I sort of talk about sort of the space that you're in, but like you can build good businesses in these areas, just understand that investors, like VC investors, hate these areas. All right, so let's get started. So this is the things the areas and platforms and spaces that investors actually dislike. So anything that's like social network or like platform, we're just very skeptical. They're very hard to reach critical mass. And so we don't like anything where it's like, I'm going to build a new social network on mobile. It's like, whatever, the social network on mobile is Facebook, right? At least in most of the Western world. Utility apps, very hard to operate. If you think about most of the very successful apps, generally speaking, they tend to be much more entertainment-based versus utility. Not sure why. The other one is browsers, right? Same story. All the big players, whether it's like Chrome owned by Google, the dominant browsers are actually owned by these major sort of like online and internet players. Delivery transportation, on demand is like done. And on top of that, Uber is a $60 billion valuation, mainly just through like taxi services. They have to go into these new delivery areas. And so who wants to compete with a company that's raised like billions of dollars, in my opinion? And so as an investor, you are very much like sort of cognizant of these things and going like, wait a minute, like why do I want to invest? Like unless you have some major differentiating factor, it's an incredibly challenging area. And the other one, gaming. So there are literally hundreds of thousands of gaming, and this is what we joke about, right? Like it's just, as a gaming studio, customer acquisition is really, really hard. Churn rates are very, very, very high. And on top of that, it's just hard to differentiate yourself versus the thousands of games in sort of like any of the app stores. And so for us, we kind of joke, it's just much easier, much more fun to invest in movies, because basically gaming is a hits business, right? Remember how big Rovio was like 4 or 5 years ago? To say they're not a top player right now because of these sort of like trends, right? Hits-driven businesses. You might as well invest in a movie because that's exactly what it's like. And the difference with at least investing in a movie is at least you get invited to like the shows, right? Like, you know, and that's the premieres. And the difference with gaming, it's just like you have no idea how well it's going to do. Doesn't mean that you can't make a good gaming company, but as an investor, this is a challenging area. Consumer messaging apps, right? How many more consumer messaging apps do you actually need? There are literally hundreds of these, partly because of the sort of the WhatsApp acquisition. But you know, the general advice I give to people is just like by the time you see like a big acquisition and big exit in a space, it's probably too late if you're planning on going into that area, because like there'll be already established players then. Okay. So this is sort of a general broad view of the things that we as investors stay away from at a general level. All right, but there's a bunch of sectors that I think most investors are very, very excited about, right? And so if you happen to be in this area, good for you, because timing actually means a lot. So trends for early stage investment. AV and VR, you know, I'm sort of a skeptic, but the reality is that, you know, we're seeing a lot of things happening in this space. And then if you look at the funding sort of situation, let's see this. There's been over $658 million that have actually been raised by 126 AR VR companies just in 2015, right? And so, you know, I still think it's early. I personally believe that it's going to take another 5 to 10 years for this area to sort of be sort of more mainstream. But a lot of the technology's there already. What is missing is actually the content. Doesn't mean you should do a content startup, but I think once the content starts coming on board with AR and VR, this will be a very, very exciting area. So we are very early in sort of the beginning of the adoption curve for AR and VR. But there's a lot of money, not just from like VCs going to the space, but like Facebook, right? You know, buying Oculus Rift, Samsung, there's HoloLens, there's just a whole bunch of different big companies that have actually invested substantially in this area. All right. The other one, Internet of Things, right? Everything, not just devices, but everything is actually connected now. And I think this trend is only going to continue. And because of this, you know, everything is becoming smarter. Your chair, your refrigerator, whatever, all the mundane things. Your elevator is already pretty smart already. One of the great things about this is just every device, what are dumb devices and dumb objects, will become smart objects. It can report and actually exchange data. Good and bad, but I think this is sort of opens up, this would be the next big wave, and it's happening already. And this been, you know, these startups have raised over $1.9 billion in 2015. So you definitely see a huge wave of, you know, of interesting sort of companies coming out of this area. And for me personally, I'm much more excited by the B2B sort of like space in sort of the IoT area versus the consumer area. But, you know, both areas are going to be very, very interesting. All right. Fintech. I'll give you an example. I have 51 companies in my accelerator batch right now. 10 of them are actually fintech companies. And so, you know, think about the numbers. Just in Q1 of like 2015 alone in the US, there's over $3 billion that went into fintech startups. And a lot of them are mobile. And the other part too is in Asia, the whole year, $3.5 billion has been invested into fintech companies. Why is that? You know, why is that happening? That's happening because a lot of the big banks are slow, right? And think about an industry where like most consumers, like whether it's like your telephone company or like airlines or banks, like banks don't treat, you know, their consumers very, very well. And so any industry that is like big, massive, slow, and very, very slow, and I would say sort of like slow to adopt new technologies, and very, very risk averse, and also industries where actually your customers hate you, these are very, very fascinating areas to be investing in, very fascinating areas that are potentially sort of like ripe for disruption. And so if you take a look at, you know, the funding trends alone, right, should actually show how interesting this area is. The other part, millennials, right? Millennials in the US has actually been, you know, these are like young folks, and I say this, I'm I'm definitely in the Generation X area. But when you look at sort of 15 to sort of like 35 age group, which is what they're calling millennials, this is a big, massive wave of of younger people. I think most of you guys are millennials. Different sort of like viewpoints in regards to how you use technology. You grew up with this technology, right? When I was growing up, I think I didn't get PCs until I was like grade 9 and 10. So that would be 15. You guys have been using like smartphones probably from the beginning, and that changes how you think about technology, your comfort level of technology, and I think this is driving a lot of the habits as well too, and driving a lot of like Snapchat, for example. The people who actually did well on Snapchat were not, generally speaking, not like older investors. They tend to be younger investors are closer to these trends. And so one of my good friends, a guy named Nico Bonazzo from General Catalyst, he was one of the earlier investors in Snapchat. And I remember asking him, like, why are you doing this Snapchat thing? I literally don't understand. And I think partly because of my sort of like the big age difference, but he kind of explained it, where if you think about the social networks or any of the technology platforms or players, generally speaking, that your parents liked, younger folks are gonna hate. And it's just like, he's like, hey, like a lot of the younger people, yes, they might be on Facebook, but their parents are on Facebook. They're not necessarily gonna be sharing all the things that they're doing as like young people. But on Snapchat, like this is something specifically just for young people. It's not easy to use. The UI and UX interfaces take some time to get used to, and this is also something where disappearing sort of like photos and things, you can goof around with your friends. It's something that they would adopt that parents have not necessarily come onto, and so that's part of the reason. Like one of the reasons he explained to me why this deal made a lot of sense. And the point I'm trying to make is that millennials just think very, very differently, and their comfort level of technology is very, very high, and that actually changes sort of how you should think about sort of like building startups, and also how they're driving a lot of trends in this area. And so watch the mobile apps that they actually like. That is a good indicator of actually potential sort of like big hits. The other one, right? So if you think about the smartphone usage, it's changing, areas are changing. Dating, right? Shopping, content consumption, fitness. There's a lot of like, how people like use a gym. Like there's a lot of these like gym training like marketplaces. And the other one is just, sharing economy, right? No surprise. This has been in play for the last like 5 to 7 years now, but I think this is only going to accelerate. Most millennials now, if you look at studies, right? They hate, majority of millennials refuse to basically use like sort of offline banking services. They don't understand, right? So that's part of the reason we've made a lot of investments in sort of like mobile related fintech companies. Dating, right? Like, dating sites like, whether it's things like Privyet, right? I was just showing Privyet earlier, or other things like Tinder. This is a very millennials driven, sort of like app. Okay, edtech. EdTech traditionally has been, kind of goes in waves of sort of popularity, but I think with sort of the confluence of like a whole bunch of different technologies coming together, like a lot of these new technologies of VR and AR is going to change like how sort of education is actually going to be doing. New teaching tech. I think a lot of new devices as well too for like schools. So the point I think I'm trying to make here is just like we're expecting a resurgence of sort of investment in EdTech. One of the things I tell a lot of companies and tell a lot of investors and tell a lot of founders is that really take a look at what's happening in sort of what I call like, edge markets, or like, I would say sort of like this idea of geo arbitrage. And so if you take a look at places like China, or you take a look at places like Japan or Korea, which have traditionally been like 3 to 5 years, partly because of infrastructure, right? Like mobile infrastructure, sort of like broadband infrastructure, and also just the fact that they're just very sort of like tech forward sort of places. A lot of the trends that actually happen in these 3 countries end up spilling into the rest of the world, like 3 to 5 years. And so everyone's heard of WeChat, right? Everyone knows WeChat? Yeah. I think a bunch of people know WeChat. What is interesting, WeChat, is that has become like the next sort of like portal. And so, WeChat is like a mobile app sort of messaging service that's used by, I think it's like, I forget the number, it's like 700, 800 million people in China. It's like a ridiculous, huge number. And what's happening now is it's become sort of a de facto platform for like many, like, for shopping, fintech, hiring, gaming, media as well too. Like there's, how a lot of people are using YouTube as sort of media platform to sort of share. Snapchat as well too, with DJ Khaled. You're seeing this all happen in WeChat over the last couple of years prior to this. And so watch what's happening in WeChat. One of my colleagues, Edith Young from the 500 Mobile Collective Fund, she actually wrote a really, really great article in TechCrunch about sort of all the different sort of applications that you're actually seeing arising on WeChat. So I highly recommend this. It's this one here. I think it's posted last year, November 26, 2015. But it's a great article to just give you an idea of what an amazing platform that WeChat is becoming. And what's happening, if you look at what Facebook is doing with their messenger apps, like they're literally going and like copying and taking a look at sort of like what WeChat's doing and trying to adopt it for the US and most of the other markets. All right, and all those things I talked about with like sort of like these connected devices and connected things, this is all generally speaking a very, very good thing. The bad thing about it, with every single new connected sort of device, that becomes a vulnerability in sort of, for hackers to basically, sort of do some bad things and sort of get into the network, right? If everything's connected and the network's this huge thing, now you have a lot of vulnerabilities. And so this is one area that I'm deadly scared about and also excited about at the same time as an investor. Think about like cybersecurity. There's been over $3.3 billion poured into cybersecurity companies in the last, just in the last year alone. And I expect this trend to sort of continue. And this is an area that traditionally 500 has not done a lot of investments in. In the next year, you'll see us through the rest of this year, next year, investing a lot more money in this space. Huge area, right? Especially as you see the rise of like IoT, this is a massive, massive issue, right? Connected government, corporations, right? And this is why this is a big deal. Think about this, right? Target was hacked, lost a lot of customer data. The stock went down dramatically, I think almost 30–40% at that time. It's recovered now. The CEO lost his job, right? Chase in the US, this is a company that spends like Chase Bank. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars into cybersecurity, into security for their systems, right? Like this is your private money sort of information. They got hacked, and I think they lost something like, I think it's like 80 million, I need to go and look at the exact, 40 million or 80 million sort of like customer data was actually stolen by them. So this is only going to continue. And so you can expect to see, from a customer perspective, all the big enterprises, this is like mission critical stuff. And so I expect and anticipate that cybersecurity is going to be a huge area for the foreseeable future, but a very, very crowded area. All right, I have questions. I know I go through this very, very quickly, but yes.
What would you say on Apple starting to lose the market? I mean, not the market, but
So
the company wars. Is it the end of hardware era? Is it the end of hardware era that Apple starts to lose its net worth? So is it Google, overtaking, or it's just minor one?
I mean, I think this has been a blip, right? The reality is that, so everyone saw like Apple had not as good of an earning in like 13 years. They've crushed their earnings. And the main reason is partly because the sales of the iPhone has been sort of like slower than normal. But the reality is that Apple makes like most of their profit margins actually from the App Store and from like iTunes and App Store, the software aspect. And also the other thing is they've been overselling a lot of like their hardware. So I think that will continue for a while. It's a very, very rich ecosystem for Apple. And so I still think that they're going to continue to be a major player. The challenge with Android is just how fragmented as a marketplace that it is. And also the monetization I mentioned earlier is still a challenge on a lot of Android devices and phones. And the ecosystem is just not as rich. It's much more, I would say it's much more tightly controlled right now. Google Play is trying to sort of like go in the direction of Apple. Still a lot of challenges. And so I still foresee iOS to be a dominant player at least for the next couple of years. I don't see it changing. I think it's a blip.
Do you think they will be able to make a leap into the self-driving cars?
I think it's a big gamble, but they have $230 billion in the bank, so who knows? They could probably buy somebody.
Thanks.
Do you actually believe into the Internet of Things? I mean, there's a lot of hype around all of this stuff, but no real movement, as I feel. Personally, I believe, but what can you say about it?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously believe, we're starting to make more investments in this area. I think have you heard of this thing called the Gartner hype cycle? Do you know this one? So, yeah, so the Gartner hype cycle is, things get hyped up and then everyone hates it and there's this trowel and then it sort of becomes, becomes widely spread. We're kind of going through the trowel right now of IoT, and also most of the applications right now that I'm seeing that's working on IoT have been on the enterprise side, not on the consumer side. So I'm much more bullish on the B2B side than I am on the sort of consumer side. Part of the reason I think most of you have not seen the developments in IoT is partly because of it's not touching you right now. But if you look at a lot of companies of how they're running their organizations, IoT is starting to make inroads there, particularly with industrial companies.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned nothing about the big data. Do you think the trend is over now?
It's the same thing. Gartner hype cycle, everyone talks about it, but the reality now is that if you take a look, if you look at trends in general, you have to watch I spend all my days doing this and talking to people, the way that these things work is that multiple trends need to come together. And so right now, you're seeing more and more data. There has always been big data in general. I think what has been missing is really the sort of applications sort of analyze and actually make sense of this. And now if you look at where computing power is and the cost of computing power, this doubling, Moore's law, we're reaching a point now where you can actually process a lot of that data. So I think there's a lot of skepticism when we say oh, we're a big data company. I think it's just expected. Everyone's a big, every company is a big data company in my opinion. And so we are going through the acceptance stage, at least part of the Gartner hype cycle, big data. It's become a normal everyday practice now. And so, but I wouldn't, as a marketing term, I don't know if I would be going out there and position myself just as a pure big data company because it's kind of an old term, but every company is a big data company.
Hi, Igor Koslev from Future Banking. You mentioned Fintech in your presentation, and what could be the next step in mobile for Fintech in your opinion? Because we have kind of joke that if you don't know what to do, create a mobile wallet because everybody doing it now. From other side, such big companies as Apple go to this market. So for startups, what's possibilities in this field?
So these are the trends in general I'm seeing in fintech, right? And fintech is a wide area, right? So there's payments, super crowded space, not an area I would touch. Insurance tech, private sort of financial management. These are two areas. So if you think about what happened in the media world, right? Where before media companies used to own everything, right? They had the TV stations, they had the movies, the content, they have music and books and everything was under sort of one company. And sort of back in with the rise of the internet, a lot of these things was this bundling was being unbundled. And so you think about banks right now, right? They have credit cards, they have basically, sort of accounts, mortgage loans, and that's the same things happening in fintech. You're seeing unbundling of these things where you have experts. So in the US, I can speak about very well. Student loans, small business loans, lending, right? Like P2P lending, all these areas are all being unbundled away from the bank. And so this unbundling, and these are trends in general. I think over time, as you're seeing a lot of unbundling, now you're seeing this movement back toward all these services being brought together and consolidating, right? At least on the mobile side. And so right now, you've seen a ton of unbundling in the last 2 to 3 years where every specific space, mortgages, real estate investing, where all used to be traditionally done through one bank or at least one big financial institute, all that is being split up now. And so this is part of the reason a lot of these big banks are very challenged. At least that's sort of, at least the first question. You had a second question? I forgot what the second question was. What areas you should be looking at, is that right?
What you can invest in?
So areas I'm investing a lot in, personal financial management. But here's one thing, just general advice I tell most startups is it's good to be, sort of be aware of what's happening from a trend perspective. But by the time a trend is actually widely recognized, unless like you have a deep fascination and interest in unique sort of attributes to go after it, don't just do a startup or don't just go join a company because it's like trendy right now. Because by the time you join, it's too late, right? And when it's widely recognized. So just, that's my caveat. But areas I'm interested in, insurance tech, because it's not a sexy area, but it's a massive, massive area. All the old guard there are just like really slow and don't really know what they're doing. And I think it requires, and they don't understand mobile at all. And so I'm looking specifically for like insurance tech companies. But areas like payments, it's so crowded. And then on top of that, you're seeing a lot of the big companies coming, like I said, Apple Pay, Google's gone into this. In Asia, the big sort of players are Alibaba and Tencent, they're all going to this area. So it's just a crowded area, and I just wouldn't touch it. It's not an area that's interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin, for your speech. You mentioned media. I'm from media. What do you think? Is there any hope for media in mobile, or there is no hope and there will be no mobile monetizing, actually?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's, I've come from that world, and media is just a really hard area to sort of play in. I think that there's room for like really deep niche vertical, but I think from so from an investment perspective, I personally, there's literally no hope at all, right? But as a startup, I think you can make a very good living, if you have highly engaged audience with sort of good content, you'll make some money off it. Just don't expect to get VC money, and that's okay, right? And this is something I would say, is that less than 1% of companies out there are VC fundable. That doesn't mean 99% of the companies out there are like not good. It just means they're not VC sort of fundable. And so I think if this is something that you like and you're working in the media space, you can still make a really, really good living sort of like building a media startup. Just don't expect VCs to sort of be excited about that, but that's okay.
Can you tell us, please, about your most two biggest mistakes as investor? One, it was a good project, but you didn't take part in the project. And another one, as example, that it was a trend project, but really it did not work.
Yeah, so boy, what mistakes! Like I've made so many investment mistakes. I'm like going through my head of which one sticks in my head. That's a tough question. So ones I've missed. I was brought a deal that was focusing on, and I don't remember the name because I'm literally trying to forget it because it was so painful. But anyways, investor friend brought me a deal, and it's in the sort of not a photo sharing, but it's sort of like what's the best way to describe it? It's mainly for B2B usage, but it's crowdsourced sort of like photo. It's kind of like what Google Maps is doing with like regular sort of like pictures of like taking pictures of areas. But this is mainly for like real estate. So when people going by certain parts of construction or like a road or something, and people just sort of taking pictures of it. I was brought this deal for a very, very low price, and I just didn't understand the space at all, so I said no. And that was actually the first investment Sequoia Capital actually made like about 2 months afterwards. And so that company is doing really, really, really well right now, and I deeply regret, and you would know which company I'm talking about. First investment that Sequoia actually made in Europe in a long, long time. I would say the second thing, I've made so many mistakes, right? I've done, out of my accelerator with my team and I've made about, in the last 2.5 years, 181 investments in that area. And then I've made in different areas, and I've made about 35 seed deals. And so the reality is in early stage, like 95% of my deals are not going to be good. So, and I've only been doing this for like 2.5 years. So it's too early to tell what is going to be like success or not. But there's certain companies where I think you just know, and I never invest based on trends. Every time I invest based on trends of like, oh, everybody likes this space, I should invest in this area, I never do well, because by the time I recognize it, by the time it's widely known, there's just a lot of players, and there's a lot of noise to try to understand sort of like what is good and what is not good. So I've learned a lot of stuff by like trying to invest against trends, right? So these are all things that are widely recognized. They're not necessarily great if you are starting off now. It means you're too late. Sorry, so I'm happy to give you more details, but just like I literally have failed in lots and lots of investments, so it's just really hard to sort of have one that sticks out.